Okay, I think we're live now.
Yes, I can confirm we are live.
I think we are live now. I'm sorry, guys. This is entirely my fuck up. Nobody else's. Live now. I'm sorry, guys. This is entirely my fuck up. Nobody else's. All right, we are live. I'm sorry, guys. This is entirely my fuck up. Okay. Nobody else's. All right, we are live.
Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on flooded folk and wild. Your new God's sullen peoples have devil and have child. Take up the white man's burden, in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror and check the show of pride. By open speech and simple, 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace. Fill full the mouth of famine and bid the sickness cease. And when your goal is nearest, the end for the sword, what's love that heed and folly? Bring all your hopes to naught. Take up the white man's burden, no tawdry rule of kings, but toil of serf and sweeper, the tale of common things. The ports ye shall not enter, the roads ye shall not tread. Go make them with your living and mark them with your dead. Take up the white man's burden and reap his old reward. The blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard. The cry of those ye humor are slowly towards the light. Why brought ye us from bondage, our loved Egyptian night? Take up the white man's burden, ye dare not stoop to less, nor call too loud on freedom to cloak your weariness. By all ye cry or whisper, by all ye leave or do, the silent, sullen people shall wail gods and you. Take up the white man's burden, have done with childish days, the lightly proffered laurel, the easy ungrudged praise. Come thou to search your manhood through all of thankless years. No age with give aught wisdom, the judgment of your peers. Take off the white man's burden through all of thankless years.
Okay, that was the excellent Chris Gard. Please go and check out his YouTube channel. My heartfelt apologies. I fucked up the start of the stream. Entirely my fault. Today I watched apparently two-tier care, so Keir Starmer, is making agreements with the European Union and Spain to surrender Gibraltar. But, that'll be the end of that colony if he does. Never been a greater traitor to Britain, in my opinion. However, this is not what we're talking about this evening. We are going to talk about the Suez Crisis of 1956 and Operation Musketeer. And because I want to get the political stuff in focus first, I'm going to ask my good friend Aaron Hook, followed by Hitman, to give us the political background to this before we go further. So, Aaron, and by the way, Aaron, injured himself today, but has still bravely come onto the stream like a really good English and British guy. Aaron, you carry on.
Oh, thanks, Duke. So, how far back do you want me to start?
Well, I suppose 1882, but try and keep it short, mate.
Yeah. Okay. So, Britain has always had sort of an interest in in Egypt as a part of just generally as a part of the Mediterranean since the 18th century, but that really takes off in the 19th century due to the concerns about the Russians expanding into the Middle East, and so the British are backing the Ottomans, and on top of that, you have the creation of the Suez Canal, the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, which shortens the route to India and therefore becomes a strategic necessity for the British. And so the British, in 1875, I believe it is, with the Disraeli government via Lionel de Rothschild buy, I think it's half, if I'm right in saying it's half the shares of the Suez Canal Company, which gives the British...
the Egyptian, it's Ismail Pasha, who's the Khedive. Yeah. He goes into bankruptcy and he's forced to sell the 44% stake that he holds to the British.
Yeah, and that's and the way this happens is Disraeli goes to Lionel de Rothschild of the Rothschild family and gets a loan of I think it's about 4 million, isn't it? At that time, and it's a loan that is used to buy the shares, and then that is paid back, and this gives the British a significant degree of influence over Egypt, given the debts that Hitman mentioned. And essentially from the mid 1870s up until the 1880s, the British become more increasingly involved in Egyptian affairs, both to the object is to shore up the Khedive's government, make sure it doesn't go bankrupt, to ensure that the Suez Canal is protected. Then the
sorry to interrupt you, Aaron. Worth pointing out the basic importance of the Suez Canal to Britain was it was the short route to India, much shorter than going all around Africa. And that's the main thing you have to realize about the Suez Canal. One of the first ships through the Suez Canal when it opened in 1869, and as Aaron correctly says, it was built by a Frenchman. One of the first ships through the Suez Canal was a British warship, because the Suez Canal gave Britain a very short route, relatively speaking, to India. And that's the thing you have to realize. Sorry, Aaron, you carry on, mate.
Can I just add something?
Yeah.
Obviously, we've mentioned the French, so yes, because the French are the ones who built the canal, and it's important because, to an extent, they feel rather peeved off when we come in and sort of steal out from under them, though they would still be a significant share, because other than us, they're the main great power with an interest in the Middle East. Obviously, considering their own role in the Suez Crisis, these are sort of the origins of that, so to speak.
Yeah, and if I'm right in saying it isn't until just before the First World War you get sort of the agreement that Egypt is very much going to be in the British sphere of influence, whereas Morocco will be in the French sphere of influence, if I've got that right.
Yes, that's part of the Entente Cordiale, yeah.
Yeah. And so what happens is, so through the late 1870s into the early 1880s, the British become more involved through, he later becomes Lord Cromer, Sir Evelyn Baring, I believe that's his name. He
Yeah, it
becomes,
is.
he's the sort of British financial bloke who oversees the Egyptian finances for the British. There's also a Frenchman there, but his role becomes increasingly large. In the early 1880s, you have a nationalist revolt under Colonel Rabi, who is, I believe, the Egyptian minister for defense minister or war minister, and there's a sort of crisis that builds up over sort of between 1880 and 1882, which then leads to the Anglo-Egyptian War of 1882. The British bombard Alexandria. They fight the Battle of Tel El Kebir, win, and this sort of establishes Britain's what will become essentially the British occupation of Egypt until until essentially the 1940s for mainland Egypt, and then the early 1950s for the Suez Canal zone. It should be said at this point, the British did not intend to remain in Egypt. If you were told really, but Evelyn Baring in 1882 that the British would still be there in 1914, he probably wouldn't have believed you. And so from 1882 up until essentially 1919, Egypt is a protectorate of Britain until 1914. The Khedive, which is the Ali dynasty's title, they're technically still part of the Ottoman Empire, but they are, to all intents and purposes, essentially under British rule. Then, when the Ottoman Empire enters World War One, Egypt declares its independence from the Ottoman Empire, and the Khedive becomes the king. And then there are, and throughout the period since the 1880s, there's been a developing Egyptian nationalist movement, and by 1919, this develops into what's called the Egyptian Revolution of 1919, where the mass protests and the British Foreign Office gives Egypt independence, but Britain still remains having troops in Egypt, which continues up until, as I say, until the late 40s. In 1936, there is the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty, which renegotiates the British relationship. If I'm right in saying, Hitman, under that treaty, the British agree to withdraw the troops at a certain date. Is it, or is it 20 year? Is it 20 years under this treaty? I'm slightly.
Well, regarding the military presence, so when Egypt became nominally independent in 1919, from that point, it was agreed that British troops could only occupy the Suez Canal zone itself, or Sinai, or the Sudan, because that was a co-dominion between Egypt and Britain, but they could not occupy the rest of Egypt. And in 1936, that was essentially agreed, but a caveat was added where if Egypt were to come under military threat from another power, Britain would have the right to send troops back into the rest of Egypt. That's what happened in the Second World War. And it's important to understand why Egypt was keen to try and avoid Britain stationing troops in the country, and it's because there was a lot of conflict and disagreements between the British soldiers and the Egyptian populace. The Egyptians didn't really like the British soldiers. They thought they were rude and a nuisance. They also, one of the problems was that when you're stationing an army, you obviously need to feed them food. And whenever, during both World War One and World War Two, the presence of hundreds of thousands of British soldiers led to a spike in the price of grain. And obviously, Egypt being a largely agrarian country that relies on the Nile, this did really cause a lot of problems with food, etc., especially as Egypt's population is starting to explode around this time. So that's another factor to consider as well.
Although I think it's important to remember the Suez Canal zone was absolutely British. British territory, wasn't Egyptian, not at all. And as Hitman correctly said, the same with the Sudan. which was an Anglo-Egyptian condominium, which officially meant it was run by the Egyptians and the British, although of course actually it was run by the British because the Egyptians weren't really capable of running Egypt, let alone Sudan. But yeah, fair enough. I think Aaron and Hitman have started us off on the right foot there.
I'll just take us the last bit. So, obviously, as Hitman says, British troops are stationed back in Egypt during the Second World War. There was an incident in 1942, I believe, the Aberdeen, Aberdeen Palace incident?
The Aberdeen, because the King Farouk was allowing some Arab nationalists who were sympathetic to the mid-century Germans too close to his circle of influence, and so we basically siege the palace and say, get rid of the government or we're going to get rid of you. And the king decides to take the wise decision and assuage to our demands. And so one other point, actually, I forgot to mention about the 1936 treaty. The other reason it's important in terms of the military is that it also allowed Egypt to expand their army and train lots of new officers. And it's this cohort of officers in 1936 that include people such as Gamal Abdel Nasser and Mohammed Naguib and Anwar Sadat, who would later go on to be lead presidents of Egypt. So that's a very important consequence later on down the line.
Utter scumbags if you're an Englishman, but utter scumbags if you're an Englishman, Hitman. But yeah, all right.
Yeah, and also it should point out that
what I would be interested from you is Anglo-Egyptian relations from after the end of the Second World War in 1945 up until 1956. What would you say about those?
Well, I should say, I'd say the main sort of point of sort of those relations was trying to get the Egyptians trying to get the British out of Sudan, which if I'm right, Hitman, they had their intentions to try and annex it themselves outright, or they wanted at least to proper protectorate the whole of the Sudan.
It's complicated because the king really wanted to take the title King of Sudan and annex it. But what's interesting is when the three officers and Nasser take over, something Nasser does, which I actually think is quite ingenious from his perspective, is that he manages to strike up an agreement with the British where Sudan is going to be an independent country. And it's a genius from an Egyptian's perspective because, remember, that treaty, the 1936 treaty, allowed Britain to station troops in Sudan. So by granting Sudan independence, Britain no longer can station troops to Egypt south. So from the perspective of the Suez crisis, I think it was a very clever move of Nasser's to let go of Sudan. But from our perspective, it's a disaster.
Yeah. And the British governments, both the Attlee government and then the Churchill government, is very much intent on keeping obviously the Suez Canal even after the independence of India, and so I believe they pulled the troops out of Egypt itself after the Second World War in 1946, maybe back then, and so the British government is focused on trying to sort of secure the Suez Canal in sort of the changing Middle East as it's becoming, and the obviously, that when you have the revolution in 1952, the three officers are, particularly Nasser when he becomes leader of the country, are determined to get hold of the
scumbag, by the way, but yeah.
And so from 1952 up until the British leave in, I believe, 1954, you have the negotiations, and now in Britain, it's Anthony Eden is obviously the Foreign Secretary, and he is the one who is negotiating with the Egyptians, and he foolishly thinks the Egyptians are also going to honour any treaty of not sending troops into the Canal Zone when the British leave. And to give Winston Churchill credit, which is not a common thing on this channel, Churchill is very, very resistant to it. He eventually does give in. But it should be put like this is very much Anthony Eden's idea. Eden is misreading the situation, the nationalist feeling in the Middle East, and essentially the Arab world as a whole. And so he has this foolish idea that if you, as I say, remove the British troops from the Canal Zone, Nasser and the Egyptians are going to honour it and not send troops in.
Yeah.
And so when the British sort of withdraw, the Egyptians then end up occupying it. Though we should point out that if I'm correct, Hitman, one of the reasons why NASA goes in occupies the Canal Zone is because he's having internal domestic difficulties, and this is an action to shore up his power base. If I've got that right.
Well, there's many other factors we need to consider here. Regarding Eden, Eden was someone very interested in the Middle East, and I've talked about this on my channel and on streams. As around this time, you've got the creation of the Arab League, which is supposed to pave the way for some Arab federation of all the Arab states. And what ends up happening is Egypt is included in this Arab League, and this completely transforms things because prior to the Arab League, Iraq was actually the leading Arab state, and by including Egypt, what Eden thought he was doing was essentially, what the British were doing rather, is creating this great federation where they can maintain influence amongst all these countries and shore up their position against the Americans and Soviets. The only problem is by including Egypt in the Arab League, you've now created this rivalry between Egypt and Iraq with, obviously, the two dominant figures would be Nasser as president in Egypt and Nouri al-Sayyid, who was the prime minister of Iraq. So again, they're butting heads because they both have their own views of what is the right course with Arab national.
Hitman, you've also got to realize that the Egyptian leader at that time, Nasser, was accepting all sorts of Soviet arms supplies and what have you. Even as early as 1954, he was starting to support Soviet communist arms supplies to him. But you've also got to look at Eden, and I mean Eden in the 1930s was desperately worried about Mussolini. He thought Mussolini was the worst person in the whole wide world, and made Britain an enemy of Italy because of Abyssinia, which was ridiculous, quite frankly, because Mussolini didn't have any particularly nasty racial policies. He really didn't. And I'm sure that the Italians ran Abyssinia way better than Haile Selassie did. But I mean, that's just me.
I wanted to mention with Abyssinia still had slavery before the Italians invaded. So
absolutely, Mitch. And all I'm saying to Hitman here, who knows way more about this than I do, is that Anthony Eden had this warped idea of the world that everyone was Adolf Hitler, kind of.
I agree with you. I mean, I did a stream on Suez with Charlemagne coming up to a year ago now, and one of the things I really learned is that Anthony Eden was a moron. He had this whole boomer truth, Nasser is a Muslim Mussolini, and if we allow the Egyptians to occupy Suez, it'll be like the Munich Agreement all over again, and it's just part of this really sort of muddled strategy.
Yeah. Whereas the more sensible British strategy would have been, well, the Suez Canal Zone is ours. We're going to keep our troops there, and what the fuck are the Egyptians going to do about it? Which is nothing. I mean, like my dad was a British soldier guarding the Suez Canal Zone from 1951 to 1953, and the British Army opinion in those days was that if we need to take over Egypt, we'll do it in 2 days, and we'll do it in 1 day if the Egyptians resist. And to be honest, if you look at the 1956 campaign, that's pretty much true. You know, like the Egyptians were not able in any place to really resist the British Armed Forces. They just weren't. But anyway, Hitman, carry on, mate.
Yeah, so you mentioned about NASA accepting Soviet aid. Well, it's interesting because, as I said, I was mentioning his rivalry with Nuri al-Said. Well, Nuri al-Said, his vision of pan-Arabism was explicitly anti-communist, so he did not want the Soviets having any influence in the Middle East, whereas Nasser, to say he was pro-Soviet, I think isn't quite nuanced enough. It's important to understand that Egypt was part of the non-aligned movement during the Cold War, so along with Yugoslavia, India and Indonesia. So these were countries that didn't explicitly side with either the America or the Soviet Union, but instead would try to play both off against each other to their own advantage. And I would say NASA pretty much did that, because other than accepting Soviet aid and weapons, it's important to note that there was American involvement with NASA, because the CIA were actually aware of the 1952 coup before it happened, and the main operative that was stationed in Egypt was Miles Copeland, and he established a relationship with NASA, and he actually helped the Egyptians set up their intelligence network. So there's certainly American aid there as well. And just to go back to again this idea of trying to keep out the Russians, another point that really pissed off Nasser and led to Suez was the British wanted to set up something called the Baghdad Pact, which was supposed to essentially be a Middle Eastern version of NATO. So it ended up being Britain, Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Pakistan. And they wanted it to include all the Middle East. They wanted Syria to join, they wanted Jordan to join, they wanted Egypt in it as well. But the Nasser would not commit Egypt to the Baghdad Pact because Britain was a member. Because as far as he was concerned, with Britain being a member, it's not really a defensive alliance to keep the Soviets out of the Middle East. It's the British Empire by another means. It's a way for Britain to keep maintaining a presence in the Middle East, and we don't want them, so we're not going to sign up to it. And it was actually Egyptian pressure that led to Jordan, Britain's key ally in the region, actually not joining the Baghdad Pact, which was critical. And I mentioned the Americans earlier. Well, what's also important to remember is leading up to Suez, Britain and America were both considering investing in Egypt to build the Aswan Dam to help create energy for Egypt. And Britain and America decided to pull out because they feel Nasser's being too friendly towards the Soviets. And one of the rationales Nasser gives for occupying the Suez Canal is, well, we can make up for the loss of investment we would have got from that canal, so not canal, so from that dam, by occupying the Suez Canal, and then we can rake in the dividends from traffic through it as compensation.
Yeah, no, look, I think you're right here, man, except that I think Nasser was an evil man. But then I'm an Englishman, and as far as I was concerned, to me, he was an evil man. And he had an awful lot of T-54 Russian tanks and all that stuff that he had imported. So, yeah, fair enough.
But we should just mention. Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry, I was about to say who was going to go next, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to mention about the. We should just mention the French and the Israelis, because obviously they're the two other participants in this the war in the operation against Egypt. The French are in at this point the Fourth Republic, which is deeply unstable. They've unsuccessfully tried to fight to keep Indochina French, but have failed. This comes apart in 1954 with the defeat at Dien Bien Phu. And they are obviously fighting quite a strong war, quite a fierce war in Algeria to keep it. And if I'm correct, the Egyptians are supporting the FLN, which is the Algerian terrorists who are fighting the French and eventually become the government. And so one of the motivations for the French is, as well as to take back the Suez Canal, which obviously they own half, they're also doing it to try and remove Nasser and cut off one of the ways that the FNL are being funded and try to cut the supply off so they will be sort of beggared and unable to fight on.
No.
Aaron, sorry, Hitman. Aaron, could I ask you, and also Hitman, please explain the alliance? I kind of understand the alliance between the British and the French. What was the alliance with the Israelis, given that, in 1948, Israel and Israeli terrorists were hanging captured British sergeants and blowing up the King David Hotel that was full of British women and children. So what I would ask Aaron and Hitman is, why did we have an alliance with Israel in 1956?
Well, ultimately, the French were the linchpin of the alliance because fundamentally, because the French, because their relationship with the Israelis is very interesting. People who want more information, I did 2 streams with Prudentialist about 2 years ago, one on my channel and one on his, looking at the French and the British in the Middle East from World War I until the end of World War II. And what's really interesting is the French and the Israelis, their relationship goes back to World War II, because what happens is that when the Free French and the British invade Lebanon and Syria to drive out the Vichy French, the British are trying to subvert the French presence there because they want these countries in Britain to have influence and not the French. So the French, feeling that Britain is just only trying to undermine her position, reaches out to the Israeli terror groups and gives them intelligence and weapons to help in their campaign against the British. So from the French perspective, well, Britain, if you're going to fuck around in our camp, we'll fuck around in yours. And so when Israel becomes independent, they strike a military pact with the French. And so the French are actually at this time one of the main arms suppliers to Israel. They're giving them rockets, they're giving them ammunition, they're giving them weapons, giving them ships, etc. Is really interesting. And the reason the French are doing this is because they want to maintain a presence in Palestine and the Middle East, and Israel's the only way they're able to do that. And the reason Britain and Israel are not coming together is partly because there's more to gain by them working together against Egypt, because it's, again, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and Egypt is a mutual enemy of both Britain and Israel, because the Israelis fought against Egypt in the 1948 war, and they really want Sinai as a buffer, and they also want access to the Suez Canal, because without it, the Israelis are stuck in the Mediterranean. Though it should be noted that they do have one port on the Red Sea at Tiran. So again, they just want another angle to move their shipping about. And it's also important to note that another reason Britain agreed to work with Israel is because there was a lot of friction between Israel and Jordan. And until the beginning of 1957, Jordan was under military protection from Britain, meaning if Israel made an attack on Jordan, Britain was compelled to defend her. And so Britain, wanting to avoid the situation, instead agreed to an operation in Suez as a way of deflecting Israeli attention away from Jordan. So that's another angle to that.
Yeah,
Interesting. Aaron, what do you?
Yeah, if I'm right, also, I'd agree with what Hitman said. If I'm also right, if I'm remembering right, Hitman, doesn't Ben Gurion approach the French with this plan of that they're going to take the Sinai and the Gaza Strip off the Egyptians, and then they're going to take the West Bank off Jordan with I don't quite know how this would have worked, but with the Iraqis taking over Jordan, and then the Israelis going after southern Lebanon, establishing a Christian Maronite buffer state for them. And this is a part of the thing that Ben Gurion approaches Mollet, the French Prime Minister, with. Am I remembering that right?
In terms of what's actually agreed, regarding Iraq and Jordan, well, around this time, Iraq and Jordan, because they're both ruled by the Hashemite dynasty, the kings were cousins, they establish a Hashemite federation where both Iraq and Jordan are part of this greater union. And that doesn't last very long, because in 1958, the king would be coups and assassinated, and Iraq would
Yeah.
become a republic. So, regarding the West Bank, I mean, I don't disbelieve that Ben Gurion would have wanted the West Bank. Regarding Lebanon, well, Lebanon at this time was under. So it's a bit of a messy situation. So the night after it became formally independent from France, Lebanon, there was a role for Muslims because, right, so in the 1930s, I think it was 34, there was a census that was done, and that census found the Christians held a slight majority, and so the constitution that was driven up when Lebanon became independent based on that 1930 census was that the Christians would hold 55% of the seats in parliament, and the president would be a Christian, but the prime minister had to be a Sunni Muslim. And the problem you have there really is, well, Lebanon's already a state dominated by the Maronites anyway, so there's no real benefit to creating another Maronite state when it's already dominated by them. The only thing I would say is that the problem with Lebanon is that many Palestinian refugees flee to Lebanon, and the Maronites can't kick them out because the Sunnis in Lebanon support the Palestinians and they don't want to cause any rifts there, so they're forced to keep them. And that leads to frequent tension with Israel because the Palestinians like to raid over the border, essentially.
Yeah. And if I'm right in saying there also that there are ongoing sort of skirmishes along the West Bank as well.
Yes.
So, from my point of view, the reason why the Israelis take part and why they're allied is just that it happened to serve Israel's interest at that time, and they happen to coincide with that of Britain and France. So
yes, because ultimately Nasser is the most powerful Arab state that's hostile to Israel, because the Iraqis, remember, don't directly border Israel, and their relations aren't as bad as the Egyptians, because ultimately, Nouri al-Said's prime minister has got good relations with Britain, and he's not really going to go against what Britain wants, and so Egypt was the main problem for Israel. So getting rid of Nasser was key.
Yeah, look, I'm going to agree with Aaron and Hitman here. Israel supported that war because it suited them, and Britain and France let them support that war again because it suited them. I will also say I went out with a Lebanese Christian girl many years ago, and she was very cute and pretty white, I have to say. But anyway, I'm going to leave that aside. All right, guys, can we move on a little bit to, I don't know, 54, 55, and, Britain leaves the Suez Canal zone, which always struck me as an idiot move. I know Hitman has already mentioned that Churchill, who is I'm no great fan of Churchill, but I think he was right about this, turned around and said, look, if you leave the Suez Canal zone, the Egyptians are going to occupy it because, of course, they are. But maybe carry on from there, guys.
Well, it's interesting because I remember discussing with Charlemagne on the stream I did with him almost a year ago, was that it at times actually seemed that Churchill was trying to play both sides off. In one moment he'd be pro this agreement, and on the other hand he wouldn't be. And there's an argument to make that because Eden was his chosen successor, he was trying to sort of create a bit of tension to allow Eden to really kind of be sure of himself and confident in what he was doing. I mean, what's your thought on that?
Yeah, I think that's certainly part of it. Also, there's an element to the fact that Churchill, by the time he gets at this point, he's very wary of making any big changes in terms of policy. That's why domestically he doesn't do a great deal outside of removing things like rationing and some denationalisation. And so I do think there's also an element of it, the fact that he's sort of unsure of what to do, because he doesn't want to make. He's very resistant, as I say, to make any big change, and so and whilst Eden was certainly is a successor, there was a sense that he and Eden were there was a certain degree of tension between them. But at this point, that Eden is wanting Churchill to go, and he has done since about 47, 48, and there was also the issue of Churchill's illness in the very early 50s, in I think 51, 52, which he kept a secret. And there's a sense then that
Didn't he have
Eden,
a stroke, Aaron? Didn't
Yes.
Churchill have a stroke?
yes, he
I
did,
believe he did.
yeah, and and Eden, there was suggestion at that time from Eden, also Rab Butler, that Churchill might have to go, but ultimately Churchill goes on his own terms, and so there's that. I think there's also an element of that tension between him and Eden over the fact that Eden wants power, and Churchill isn't willing to sort of be forced out.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree. And also, speaking politics, it also is important to mention around this time you've got the creation of the Suez Group, the MPs who are opposed to any further shrinking of the British Empire or the loss of Suez, and it's led by a certain Enoch Powell.
Yeah, 100% him, man. And this was pretty much the same group of people who later on supported Rhodesia, for example. Almost the same MPs. And they were the last, in my humble opinion, they were the last honest, patriotic British MPs. I've got to say, I think that's what they were. You know, who supported Britain above anybody else. And this is the thing that people don't always get right about me. Like, we're talking this evening about the Suez Crisis and Operation Musketeer. My view on this is entirely what was best for Britain. I don't give a shit about Egypt or Nasser or any of the Egyptians or Arabs. I only care what was good for Britain. I mean, I'm not pretending about this. This is how I always have been and always will be, I hope. So yeah, you know, the Suez group of MPs was quite important, and as Hitman says, included Enoch Powell, and they were the MPs who actually considered what was good for Britain. And you know, the same was also true later on for the people who supported Rhodesia. They were the true British patriots. And the MPs who didn't support them were scum, including, you know, Edward Heath and Harold Wilson and all the rest of them. But yeah, Mitch, you haven't said much for long, mate, so I'm going to ask you to have a thing before we go back to Hitman and Aaron.
As I said earlier, I'm not really confident about the politics side. I will say, I mean, the only politics side I know of it is essentially you have Anthony Eden, who's presented as being rather a diddler, Churchill, who, for all his faults, had the correct instincts on this, which was, look, the Suez Canal being very important, and we should keep on to it, because I think at this point the Tory party was still committed to east of Suez, for example. So there was, so the Tory party institutionally wanted to keep control of the Suez Canal, whereas the Labour Party, under Gateskill, who I'm not too well read on Gateskill, but he's certainly not a Jeremy Corbyn style figure. Although that's rather,
but he still doesn't want Britain to be a world power. But like every single socialist MP there's ever been, going right back to the 1890s, wanted Britain to be a minor power with no power anywhere. That's a fact. That's just the fact.
That
Go back to Care Hardy. That's what they always wanted. They were terrible people who were extremely anti-British.
I'm going to push back very slightly and make an exception for a bloody Ernest Bevin, who was the foreign minister for most of Attlee's
time.
A
little bit, yeah. Fair enough, Hitman. Fair enough.
Yeah, because he was pretty practical, and because regarding the 1948 war, he was like, "Listen, it's not good for us to lose our influence here. We need to support Jordan against Israel." And no, I think he was quite savvy. But other than him, then yeah, I agree with you.
Yep, I'll give you a break for Bevan, but only a little bit. But yeah, in general terms, like every single left-wing and liberal prime minister really wanted Britain to be a small, not very important place. And as far as I'm concerned, that's not a good thing if you're a Brit or an Englishman. It just isn't. I'm sorry. But anyway, Mitch, I agree with what you said, but I'm going to put it back on Aaron and Hitman because they're our politics guys. So go for it, gentlemen.
I think it might be worth now looking at the Americans' perspective on this, because prior to sort of going in, Eden and Selwyn Lloyd, who's the foreign minister, are trying to understand the American perspective on this. Now, obviously, you've got Eisenhower as the president, and then you've got John Foster Dulles as the Secretary of State. And so, again, Dulles was obviously the one who's dealing with the whole investment in the Aswan Dam. And so his view of it is that if Britain and France go in, he kind of thinks, well, you better not do it without our consent, essentially. And the main problem with 1956 is that it's an election year. And so Eisenhower, from my understanding, wasn't completely unsympathetic to us, because it's important to remember that in 1953, it was the Americans who aided us in overthrowing the Mossadegh in Iran and allowing Anglo-Persian to return its oil operations, because there was a long standoff from 1951 when it was nationalised, and the coup didn't happen until 2 years later. And so fundamentally, I somewhat feel that had we been a little bit more patient and waited for Eisenhower to have settled the election, we possibly might have had him be a bit more sympathetic to us and trying to sort this out. But we didn't do that, because our view was actually, and this is something Ben-Gurion tried to convince us and the French of as well, you see, we've got our Jewish lobby in America, so Eisenhower won't dare counter-signal us attacking Egypt because we're involved during the election, because he won't want to lose the Jewish vote. But what ends up happening is when we do go in, Eisenhower, instead, he's more concerned about the general public's view of allowing his allies just to invade another country, and instead it compels him to clamp down harder. And another point that's important to understand from the perspective of Dulles and Eisenhower is that the Suez crisis was not the only international problem. Earlier, you have the Hungarian Revolution in '56, and when the Khrushchev sends the tanks into Budapest, and the Soviets come off looking very poor in the international press because they're seen as, it's the origin of the word tanky, funnily enough, because they just invaded one of their subjects to try and instill their will. And so when Suez happens, it gives the Soviets an excuse to distract away from Hungary. And that's one of the other reasons why Eisenhower was quite pissed off. Does anyone want to give any of their perspective on that? Or
I would disagree that it was a strategic mistake to go in during an election year. And I think also what Ben-Gurion did sort of misunderstand Eisenhower's situation in the United States. He was the Great War being sort of really important in winning the Second World War in Europe.
You're cutting out a bit, Aaron. Maybe be a bit closer to your microphone. Sorry, mate.
Is that better? So Eisenhower is seen as one of the greatest living Americans at that point, given his role in the Second World War, and therefore, as Hitman said, he could he was therefore more concerned with the general public, and he could use that sort of credit in the bank in terms of his public image to take a stand. And I do agree with Hitman that things would have been a lot different if it hadn't been taking place during the election year. If the invasion had taken place in the spring of 1957 instead of the autumn of 1956, the situation would have been very different.
Yeah, the Brits took months and months and months to get Operation Musketeer ready. We really did, partly because of the way the Ministry of Defense was organized. But yeah, it took a very long time. And the fact is, the Americans knew we were going to do this for months and months and months, and Eisenhower ignored it until he didn't. I think Eisenhower was a fairly anti-British guy when he was president, mostly because he didn't like Montgomery, which is fair enough. I wouldn't have liked Montgomery either. But yeah, I think there's a great deal of truth to that. Pass it over to you guys.
Well, other than that, I don't think there's much else political or diplomatic other than in terms of actually planning the operation, because there's a lot of back and forth, and ultimately, when they all agree to go in, it's something called the Sèvres Protocol, which was a meeting where the Israelis and the French kind of make this declaration where they are going to make a play for the canal. And there was what's important is to understand is that the French and the Israelis are the most gung-ho for this. We or the British are actually the most reluctant party, and there's an element of us being dragged along by them. And what ends up happening is Patrick Dean, who is a British representative, I think it's the British ambassador to France, he's tricked into signing this protocol, and Eden is horrified after he signs it because it irrevocably commits us to going in.
Well, I mean, even more important, in my opinion, is that, Britain had run the Suez Canal zone up until 1953. Why the hell did we pull our troops out? We had no need to. This is, I think Hitman talked about this a bit earlier on. Why do you pull your British troops out of the Suez Canal zone? You didn't need to, because it was British territory. Yeah, Egypt was independent. Absolutely it was. As Hitman also spoke about, to some degree, Sudan was independent because it was a condominium between Britain and Egypt. But, I mean, only to some degree, to be fair. But Britain didn't have to pull its troops out of the Suez Canal zone, and why did they do so? It doesn't make any sense to me, to be honest.
Well, it's interesting you say that, Iron Duke, because if you look at the entire British relationship with the Egyptians from 1919 of the revolution until the Suez Crisis, that is essentially a whole relationship. It's just us constantly cucking to the Egyptians over nothing, and it's just incredible.
Yeah, Britain effectively ran Egypt. And, the British Army saying in the 1950s was, if we need to take over Egypt, we'll do it in a day. Sorry, we'll do it in 2 days. But if the Egyptians fight, we'll do it in 1 day. Because, honestly, the Egyptians were not the best soldiers in the world. They really weren't. So to me, the whole thing is crazy, because if you run the Suez Canal zone, why are you going to withdraw the British troops from the Suez Canal zone? Like, you know, my dad was there from 51 to 53, guarding the Suez Canal zone, and the chances of the Egyptian army taking that over were way less than zero while he was there. So why don't you just leave the British troops there, and then you don't have to reinvade the damn place? That's part of what I've been looking at over the last 48 hours, particularly to Hitman and Aaron, and I've not quite worked out why did we withdraw those troops in the first place? It doesn't make any sense.
Well, the only thing I'll say with Eden is I think, again, Eden, going back to the Baghdad Pact and going back to the geopolitical situation, I believe what he was trying to do was essentially make a goodwill gesture to Nasser in hopes of appeasing him to obviously try and stabilize the area. The only other thing I will say is I think Eden, because of that clause, because remember, in that agreement where we pulled out, because we still were going to own the canal, I think it was until 1968, the treaty did stipulate that we had the right to reoccupy Suez again if we felt it was military under threat. And I think Eden believed that that was enough to cover our ass. Essentially, well, you know, he won't do it because we're saying that we'll reoccupy it if they make a move. And Nasser called our bluff. So
insanity, Hitman. If you have troops in place, you keep them in place. Look, I heard a story today that Britain, and that means two-tier Keir Starmer, has agreed with the EU and Spain to allow the EU to control the Gibraltar border. Now, as far as I'm concerned, that is the end of the Gibraltar colony. It's the beginning of the end of the Gibraltar colony. And if anyone doesn't believe that, I'm sorry, then you're a moron. Because, you know, Starmer's already given up the British Indian Ocean territory. He will give up everything if he possibly can, because I don't know. Let me try and get this right. I think Sir Keir Starmer is like a cuck guy who likes taking it up the arse. And that is the guys who are running Britain today. Even, I have to say, people like Nigel Farage. Look at his new chairman of the Reform Party. He's a gay guy. He's a gay guy.
I will say, like the movie, I think his name's Herman. Who's I can't remember what his job title is. Well, basically, you generally get a sense of they believe in international law, that they have this high trust set mold where we must hold ourselves to higher standards than, let's say, something like Egypt under Nasser would do, and we just end up being taken for fools by
100, Mitch, 100. And there is no high standard in international law. International law is how much military power do you have, basically. If you don't have any, then you have nothing in international law. You can pretend to be, you can be gay Starmer and say, yeah, I want to take up the arse, boys. And we'll give you the British Indian Ocean territory, and we'll give you Gibraltar. You can be that if you want to be, but that ain't my Britain. That ain't my Britain at all, actually. So I'm sorry, Hitman. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, it's all right. But I'm loath to quote Stalin, but as he once said, "Oh, the Pope. How many divisions does he have?"
Yep, 100%, mate. 100%. I'm increasingly cynical, if you like. I remember the guy who Reform have made their chairman now. who I mostly noted was gay, even though he never said he was gay, but it's pretty fucking obvious. He's not going to do what he needs to do to keep Britain as a majority Anglo-Celtic population. He will never do that. I don't think Tice will ever do that. I'm quite sure that Mohammed Youssef will never do that. I'm not even sure Nigel Farage will, to be honest. But I'm kind of changing the subject a bit. But anyway, the point is, it took months and months to get Operation Musketeer, which was the British operation to take over the Suez Canal zone again, that we'd only given up a couple of years previously. It took months to get it in position. But when it did, like the Royal Marines, the Parachute Regiment, the Royal Navy and the Fleet Air Arm all did their stuff, and we actually won all the military engagements really easily. I'll ask Hitman, because I know he's into his Arab and history. I don't think there was one single engagement that the Egyptians managed to win, was there?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
So, yeah, militarily it was entirely successful, but Eisenhower didn't like Eden, which is fair enough. I wouldn't have liked Eden either. And he was also quite biased in his appreciation of the British, because he detested Field Marshal Montgomery. And again, I actually don't blame him, because Montgomery was an arsehole. But yeah.
But ultimately, don't forget the Dulles, who's the Secretary of State, was also very influential as well in terms of America's response.
For sure. Aaron, bitch.
Just for the military side, it's worth bearing in mind that the Egyptian side, they had some false assumptions, although they were based on somewhat realistic. For example, the Egyptians' very initial battle plan was hold off the Israelis, and then they'll be able to hold off an amphibious landing of us. Because the thing was, the Israeli army, for example, yes, they were quite battle hardened and aggressive and whatnot, and had, but ironically enough, had similar issues to what the mid-century Germans would have, which was, they might be very aggressive and have great initiative, but their logistics are quite poor. And the Egyptians thought, well, if we hold off the Israelis long enough, the logistical issues will inevitably mount up, so that they can't fight anymore, and then we can repivot our forces. This leads to NASA investing too many troops into the Sinai region, to a point where, when inevitably we start rolling in with Operation Musketeer, or as the French call it, Operation Telescope, if I remember correctly, it creates a whole lot of problems for the Egyptians, and NASA has to start overruling Amir, his military guy. So that's one reason why.
To be fair, Mitch, the Egyptians were absolutely useless soldiers anyway. But
yeah, but that's the point. Oh, sorry.
One other thing to add before we really get into the campaign proper is it's in regards again to how they're going to launch this, because one of the things, because again the British and French were still a bit wary about the Americans wising up to what was going to happen, and so what Eden and Malay tried to do was convince Ben Gurion that, okay, Israel, you're going to make the first move and invade Sinai, and what we are going to do, Britain and France, is about a day or two later, we're then going to come in and declare a neutral zone in the canal and a demilitarized region where Israeli and Egyptian forces can't cross. So essentially, the plan was that, we're going to fake this war between Israel and Egypt and then use it as a pretext to reoccupy the canal. Mission accomplished.
Wow.
The only
almost
problem,
it's almost like as many Middle Eastern wars as you can think of.
well, funnily enough, the reason this failed is because Ben Gurion was like, "Sorry, we're not going in first on our own without backup. We either all go in together or we don't go in at all." And we both cut to his demands. And so when we went all in together, the jig was up and the Americans knew what we were trying to do.
But nonetheless, the British easily captured all of the bits of the canal we tried to capture. Easily, actually.
Yeah, because it's on the 29th that Israel invades Sinai. We issue our ultimatum on the 30th. And then regarding the name, because you mentioned Operation Musketeer. So Musketeer was the original plan, but later it was revised and became as Operation Revise. And then when Mitch mentioned Telescope, Telescope was the final third phase of Operation Revise. And I actually would like to get your thoughts, because the original plan was, instead of doing, the Marines and, the SES and whatever into Suez, the original plan was for a 300,000 strong, an 80,000 strong Anglo-French force to beat the 300,000 strong Egyptian army in one big pitched battle, and it was going to be launching an amphibious assault on Alexandria, after which we would be waging a battle of annihilation to destroy the army. And then
wouldn't have lasted long, man. The Egyptian forces would have been destroyed very quickly.
No, don't.
Yeah, they weren't very good. They weren't very good. The plan, as it actually turned out, was like the Royal Marines landed and the Paras landed, and as you would expect in both those cases, they pretty quickly beat the Egyptian opposition. Like I said, when my father was guarding the Suez Canal zone between 1951 and 1953, the British Army saying was, "We'll take over Egypt in 2 days, and one day if they resist," because the Egyptian army was shit. I mean, I'm sorry, it just was. In 1956, the Egyptian army was shit. Absolute
I don't disagree with you. What I was just trying to say, though, is that ultimately, once Alexandria had been taken, the plan was then to destroy the rest of the army and then march on Cairo and overthrow Nasser. The reason they didn't decide to go through with that plan is, one, it would have led to a far greater number of casualties, especially Egyptian civilian casualties, and ultimately that's why they didn't go with that. I'm actually trying to wonder, do you think that would have been more effective than what we ended up doing ultimately?
Well, no, but as soon as the Americans said, "No, you're not going to do that," but the point is, my political position has always been that Eden should have said to Eisenhower, "Well, if you are really going to bankrupt your biggest ally against the Soviet Union," which in those days Britain was, Eden should have said, "Yeah, go for it, mate." And I don't think Eisenhower would have done that, to be honest. But Eden, in the same way that he was an idiot in making Mussolini a British enemy in the 1930s, Eden hadn't changed. He was still a complete fucking idiot and was creating enemies where he didn't need to. Whereas in this particular case, I think Eden should have said to Eisenhower, "Well, if you want to bankrupt your main enemy, your main ally against the Soviet Union, go for it, mate."
Well, there's a comment from Matterman. Would the plan have included a reinstatement of the Egyptian monarchy? Possibly. I mean, because King Farouk was exiled in 1952 and he was chilling out in Italy. So possibly, if Nasser had been overthrown, but I don't remember reading anything that explicitly stated that was the plan.
King Farouk was the Egyptian king when my dad was first sent to Egypt. And my dad always thought, yeah, he was all right, I guess. we could control him pretty well. So yeah, why not? Why not?
And sorry, something else I wanted to say about Eden. The funny thing about Suez is that, there's this sentiment which I just don't agree with, that, Anti-Eden was some great statesman that was brought low by this one mistake. And I'm like, no, he was an idiot who made fuck-ups throughout his career, if anything. Suez is a culmination of a bloody awful career more than anything.
Totally agree with you. I couldn't agree with you more. Hitman, couldn't agree with you more. And I just heard Aaron say he agreed. Eden was a moron. He was a moron in the 1930s when he deliberately made Italy under Mussolini an enemy of Britain when Mussolini was no enemy of Britain, really. In fact, he probably preferred Britain to Hitler for the most part. If you hadn't have had Eden, no, totally agree with you, Hitman. I think you're entirely correct. Eden was an idiot. He was a moron. And also, Churchill said, "Look, you guys know I don't like Winston Churchill, right? I really don't." But Winston Churchill said a very true thing about the 1956 Suez crisis. And he said, I never would have dared to do it, but if I had have dared to do it, I wouldn't have dared to stop, which is what Eden did.
He blinks before the other side blinked, so fatal.
Yeah, if you were Eden and you were doing 56 and Suez, you needed to say to Eisenhower, well, you do your worst, mate. And my honest opinion is that because Britain in those days was easily the most important ally of America, probably Eisenhower would not have actually bankrupted Britain, because what would America have gained from that? I don't think they'd have gained anything. But Eden just stopped and therefore became a good little boy.
Yeah, just to illustrate why Eden's so terrible, when I did my stream with Semi-Agog on the Milner group, there's something about him I discovered which just, it so disgusted me. It's that when he was foreign secretary, he kept, as you mentioned, he made an enemy of Mussolini, but he kept virtue signalling when it came to dealing with Italy or Germany. And whenever the government for example, in 1937, the government wanted him to make a state visit to talk to Hitler, and he just said, no, I won't do it. I'm not going to talk to that bad, evil man. And so he went off on holiday, and they sent Lord Halifax instead. And what's even worse, Iron Duke, is that in 1938, he resigned as foreign minister over something really pathetic. Basically, the government wanted to try and get Mussolini to stop supporting the nationalists in the civil war in Spain, and so what their plan was to do was, in exchange for Mussolini withdrawing from Spain, Britain would recognise the conquest of Abyssinia, and Eden was like, "No, we're not making any deals with fascists," and resigned. So just complete pathetic wanker.
Hitman, when you mentioned that one where Halifax went instead of Eden, is that the occasion when Halifax first met Hitler and almost mistook him for a servant at that hunting show?
It was a diplomatic meeting in 1937. I don't know. I don't know about that story you mentioned, but I know it was in 1937. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, because it was Constantine von Neuwirth who was telling him, "Oh, that's bloody Hitler." He was I believe it is a meeting, in reference.
Yeah, for those who don't know, what happened was Halifax obviously went there, and he was being essentially had a foreign office Mandarin with him, and Hitler was there, and Halifax mistook him for a servant and went to hand him his coat. And it was you had an international incident that was only stopped by the Mandarin intervening in time.
Very interesting.
Sorry, Hitman. All I will say to this is totally agree with what Hitman just said. Eden, was, I don't know what Eden was, but he wasn't a good British politician or diplomat. The British politician and diplomat, I always think, is the brilliant guy, is Lord Salisbury. Lord Salisbury looked at everything from what is good for Britain. Every single thing he did was what is good for Britain. And I think after 1902, when Lord Salisbury retired due to old age, almost every single British politician and diplomat since then, high up politician and diplomat since then, has been some description of traitor. I'm sorry. And that absolutely applies to Anthony Eden. Anthony Eden, we talked about this a little bit earlier here, man, with when British troops were withdrawn from the Suez Canal zone. It was only a year or so later that Anthony Eden wanted to send them back in. Why withdraw them in the first place? It doesn't make any damn sense. Because NASA's never going to keep to his agreement. Of course he's not. He's an Egyptian nationalist. He doesn't give a shit about Britain.
No, exactly.
I mean,
just
any more than the recent British Prime Minister, who was an Indian, really gave a shit about Britain. I'm sorry, changing the subject, but you know what I mean. Eden is not someone I like at all. Good to see Horace in the chat, by the way.
I just want to respond to Horace here, because it's interesting you bring this up, Horace, because when I talked to Charlemagne about this on my stream, an analysis he made is that, really, if you think about it, from 1905 to 1956, that is the period of the Entente Cordiale, and the Suez Crisis was the last hurrah of the Entente Cordiale. After then, Britain and France go on radically different courses. We cozy up to the Americans and stay in their sphere of influence and go full Atlanticist. Whereas France, the Fourth Republic falls, you have de Gaulle come in, and de Gaulle instead pursues, rapprochement with the Germans and really pursues a European strategy. So I wouldn't quite say we went with Europe, but the French certainly did.
I don't think we should go with Europe either, to be honest, man, because we're not a European country. We're an offshore island. If we kept it, we should actually have a decent navy. We don't at the moment, but that's successive British governments. But whatever.
Well, it's interesting because ultimately, when de Gaulle blocked us from joining the EU, it's interesting, isn't it? Because again, the French were involved in Suez, and from their perspective, they were the most gung ho, and they were far more committed to fighting it to the end. It's only because we cucked out and withdrew that they had to give up. And so, from de Gaulle's perspective, he just saw us as unreliable, I think, to an extent.
Well, to be fair, though, man, I mean, what was it, 61? That de Gaulle betrayed all the French people in Algeria? I think it was only 61. It wasn't that much later.
I don't know much about that to really comment. I just know from watching AM stream on de Gaulle that he's a bit more sympathetic to de Gaulle in that situation. So
no, I'm not unsympathetic to de Gaulle, but the French in Algeria, and Algeria was actually a department of France. It wasn't a colony at that stage. De Gaulle betrayed, and this is why the French Foreign Legion wanted to do a coup against him. De Gaulle betrayed the 1 million+ French people who were in Algeria. He did. can't argue against that because it's a fact.
And I mean, no, I
Yeah,
won't
I got-
disagree that was certainly bad for France, but again, until I read more about
Yeah.
it, I don't want to pass too much of a judgment.
All I'm
Yeah.
saying is, Hitman. It was a bit like what happened to Rhodesia, for example. Yeah. Sorry, Mitch, you were saying something.
I was. I don't know if I imagine this will be mentioned later, although when we go into the more military side. But so France at the time of the Suez Crisis, they were fighting the war in Algeria, and they had to take some of their best troops from the Algerian front to take part in Suez. Now, and this and to echo what Hitman was saying earlier about committing the French war, it's also worth noting. So generally, whenever we took prisoners off the Egyptian army, we generally treated them all right, like in according to our doctrine and whatnot. Whereas the French, they just have a policy of no prisoners and shoot first, questions later, kind of approach.
I
So-
can't say anything on that, Mitch, because that might be used to convict me for something that two-tier care wouldn't like. So I'm not going to say a word about it.
Yeah, I will say, like, let's just say the French, they didn't have the same concerns. Because, I mean, I don't know too much. I mean, the GDR factor Egypt used to be was until recently a concern of ours. So you can imagine PR was more important for us, whereas the French, they're just like, well, smash the Egyptians, and that's all we need to do to tell them to back off from the canal. That's what the French kind of mentality about it was. I mean, not Egyptians, the Israelis were of a similar mind as well regarding how to deal with Egyptians in a diplomatic.
The Israelis never gave a shit about civilians or prisoners or what anyone. They never did. And anyone
Yeah,
who
it's-
pretends they did is a liar. But I mean, whatever.
Yeah, there were cases of like Israeli border troops who were just going to Arab villages and do things that would get you done in The Hague. Let's just say I won't delve into more than that.
For sure.
Well, I'll just add and say quickly that I've read Glad Pasha's Soldier with the Arabs, and some of the things the Israelis did to Palestinian refugees is just unspeakable, and that's all I'll say.
Yeah, I also read a book.
Hitman, 100%.
There's a book. I can't remember what it's called. Basically, it's all about how the Israeli/Zionist lobby managed to lobby America into creating Israel, and he went into some detail about what Israeli militias during the War of Independence in 1948 would do to Palestinian civilians. And yeah, it's basically the same gruesome detail as what you can hit, like, as akin to, for example, what Ukrainians did to Poles in World War II. So it's worth noting that when the Israelis go into the Sinai region, they have no concerns whatsoever about civilians, and also it doesn't, and also they didn't care for civilians according to the military doctrine either, because as I said earlier, Israeli military doctrine is all about aggression, hit hard and hit fast. They've got according to such a doctrine, you can't really spare a thought for civilians either. So yeah, that's
I think,
Mitch,
I think you're being kind to the Israelis, but whatever.
I would just say this is not my forte, so I would just say, look, I mean, I've only read one book about the state of Israel in terms of its founding and whatnot, and in terms of what activities they would do. I'm just trying to be lightweight and saying what they would do to civilians, especially Palestinian civilians. Yeah, it would be the kind of thing where you couldn't say it on YouTube for obvious reasons.
Mitch, look, you can look at the USS Liberty if you would like, or you can look at what Israeli Haganah terrorists who later became politicians in Israel did to British NCOs who they'd captured in the late 1940s, who they hung. you can look at what Israeli terrorists.
I'm just like, so before Colin
Hang
says
on,
anything,
hang on, Mitch.
I was just going to say, like, before Colin went to,
Mitch,
of course, against that better judgment by Alison Weir, that's the book I was referencing about how
fair enough. But Mitch, you can also look what Israeli terrorists did with the King David Hotel.
I'm aware,
where they killed many British women and children, as well as a few servicemen. So, I have no room for Israeli terrorists. I think Israeli terrorists as bad as any other terrorists. Do I still think there are Israeli terrorists in the Israeli government? Probably.
Duke, I'm not disagreeing on this. I'm just saying that.
I know.
Better play with Israel. That's just my point.
Yeah, no, I know.
Well, you say that, Iron Duke, but the Likud party, the party that leads the current government coalition, the one headed by Netanyahu, Likud was founded by Menachem Begin, the former leader of the terror group, and he would be Israel's 6th prime minister. I
know, mate, and I totally agree with you. And I think he was a disgusting bastard, basically. But I totally agree with you here, man. Not arguing in the least degree.
Just as a small side note, it's not really a big thing. Queen Elizabeth II, she used to just regard Israel in general as terrorists. Like, she used to regard all Israeli governments as basically being terrorists, which, given in mind that she was in her early 20s when Israel, for example, when the State of Israel was founded, when guys like Menachem Begin, you can see why she had that view for her entire life about Israel just generally being full of terrorists, in her view.
Yeah. I'm not going to argue with any of you guys about that. I'm a great fan of Israel. So,
well, I do know someone who was a fan of Israel. One of the chief British military officers at Suez, Iron Duke, was a certain Hugh Stockwell. Do you know much about him?
No, not a lot.
Well, prior to Suez, he was actually the British garrison commander in Haifa in Palestine. And my friend Hunger sent me a clip he found of an old British veteran of Palestine. And he was talking about Palestine and being stationed there. And this British veteran had nothing kind to say about Hugh Stockwell, because he said Stockwell was basically a Zionist who completely sided with the Israelis over the Palestinians. And there's a particularly revolting incident where the Israelis were literally ethnically cleansing the Palestinians from Haifa. And the Hugh Stockwell was like, basically said to the Palestinians, because they were saying, well, can you intervene? They're like literally ethnically cleansing us. And he said, well, no, I'm not going to do that. You need to stop fighting and declare a ceasefire. And it's like, we're not fighting. We've literally got no weapons and they're just driving us out of our homes. And then he said to the Palestinians, oh, you're the most like treasonous, disgusting people ever. And it's just like, what a wanker.
Did he have a certain early life, him?
From what I can see, his early life, no, he didn't belong to the tribe. I just think he was a bit of a Zioshil, unfortunately.
Yeah, anyone who thinks I'm a big fan of the Israelis must never listen to me. But my basic position on the Middle East today, in 2025, is I'm entirely neutral. I don't care if every Israeli kills every Palestinian or every Palestinian kills every Israeli. I just don't want any British boys killed in that war. It's not our war. It's not our war. I don't want our troops or airmen or sailors involved in it. It's not our problem, really. That's my view on it. Like, I'm entirely neutral. You know what? These wanks who wander around London or Melbourne with Kafir Palestinian scarves on, I think they're scumbags. But you know what? The guys with the Israeli flags, equal scumbags, don't want to know any of them, basically. You know, I support the Grand Old Union flag and the English flag and the Scottish flag and the Welsh flag and the Northern Irish flag. Don't want to see Israeli flags anywhere, basically. But I also equally don't like the Palestinians. I like fuck all of them, basically. Not our problem anymore. We've had enough of our guys killed by these scumbags of all different descriptions and flavors. Not our problem anymore. Fuck all of them. Go away. Kill each other. Don't involve us. That's my view on it.
Well, despite what I'm known for, to dissuade any confusion, I'm just because I'm interested doesn't mean I'm a simp for the Palestinians. I mean, I describe there's this idea, you're either pro-Israeli or you're pro-Palestinian. Well, no, I'm just anti-Zionist.
Yep, me too. That's exactly me, Hitman. I'm anti-Zionist, but I'm not pro-Palestinian. I'm pro-British, basically. I'm pro-British. And you know what? Zionists, Palestinians, all these people, they're not pro-British. So I don't give a shit, right? I'm pro-British.
I would just, if you want to know about this chapter of like history, government stuff like what Israel is for the Palestinians, I'd share a book I mentioned earlier, Alison Weir's Against Our Better Judgment, because there's a small chapter in there. There's only like a few pages. It will just tell you some of the gruesome details of what Israeli troops were doing to Israeli militias were doing to Palestinian civilians.
All right. I'm going to try.
That's what I'm going to say.
I'm going to try and be fair here, Mitch, and I'm going to say, do you know what? Sometimes Palestinians do vicious things to Israelis, and quite often Israelis do vicious things to Palestinians. Neither of them are my problem or British people's problems. Go away, fuck off, fight your own wars, and stay out of Britain, and stay out of Australia, and stay out of other people's countries. All of them. Both sides.
Yeah, so
the only bit of nuance I would add is that most of the Palestine simps in Britain are not Palestinians, they're just other Muslims. So
100 Hitman, 100. Look, like I said, I'm trying to make this as clear as I can. I'm a British guy. I'm an Englishman. I don't care about these Middle Eastern wars. They can all go and kill each other, as far as I'm concerned, so long as our boys are not involved.
No, and that's fair. And we should probably get back to Suez. So we're starting to turn into an Israel-Palestine stream.
Well, yeah, and it happens. Of course, it does. But you know what? Militarily, Suez, Operation Musketeer, was extremely successful. British Royal Marines and Parachute Regiment, Fleet Air Arm did their stuff, and the Egyptians got beat, got killed, and surrendered. That's really what happened, to be honest.
And then what happens that leads to us pulling out is Eisenhower and Dulles are able to draft a UN resolution that calls for a ceasefire that passes 64 votes to 5. The 5 that vote against is Britain, France, and we're supported. So Britain, France, Israel, and the other 2 that support us are Australia and New Zealand.
Hey, man, why didn't Britain just veto that?
Oh yes, because we were members of these. Oh, yeah, because we're both members of the Security Council. Could we have vetoed
So why didn't Britain veto it? Because we could have.
One moment. Okay, so sorry. There's a resolution that calls for it, which we both veto, but then the General Assembly of the UN calls another one, and that one I don't think we could veto, and that's what passed.
Funny how it never happens against America, China, or Russia, right?
well, America and China maybe. Considering the war in Ukraine, I'd say Russia not so much.
Well, I meant the Soviet Union back in those days, but yeah.
Yes, the Soviets are. Yeah, the Russians are good until the fall of communism, and then they're the bad guys again. Funny how that works, eh?
Yep, they're evil. The Russians, I know. They're easily winning the war in Ukraine, but they're evil. Absolutely.
Actually, we can relate this to the stream because a take Charlemagne has shared elsewhere is that of his view of the Russia-Ukrainian war, he sees Russia with this war being like post-collapse of the Soviet Union, a bit like Britain post-World War II, and the war in Ukraine is their version of the Suez Crisis, and they're just simply choosing to fight it and not CAC.
Maybe. The difference is the USA has done their worst to the Russians, and the Russians are still easily winning and killing vastly more Ukrainians than they're losing. But, whatever.
I guess the only thing we've not really talked about is the financial situation, because what ultimately leads us to pull out is Eisenhower orders that reserves of sterling be sold, and this causes about £30 million worth of losses. And something interesting I read was that Harold Macmillan, who was the Chancellor, he allegedly exaggerates the damage done by this to Eden. He says it was...
Harold Macmillan was a lefty, by the way, Hitman, but yeah, absolutely.
Oh, well, obviously winds of change in South Africa, so yeah. But yeah, he exaggerates it to 100 million, and this is allegedly what gets Eden to finally withdraw. And finally, when Eden is forced to resign a short while later, Macmillan becomes Prime Minister. So you have to wonder what Macmillan's motivation was in that, don't you think?
I'm sure the CIA had nothing whatsoever to do with that, Hitman. Nothing at all.
Yeah, the only thing we could say is that I know Eden at the time during Suez was actually very ill with stomach cancer. So I think that was kind of an excuse for him, but I think Suez had its role in that too. So
I'm not a fan of Macmillan, I've got to say, but Aaron, you haven't said much for a while, mate. So what do you think?
Yeah, sorry about that. My internet kept dropping out. Sorry about that. But Macmillan certainly he's fast and loose with the truth after he becomes Prime Minister. He very much tries to pretend that he didn't quite know what was going on, even though he was clearly involved via the cabinet in what was going on over Suez, and I've no doubt he exaggerated it. Interestingly, when it comes to the British economy, the sort of difficulty you have with sterling when the Americans started to sell it could have been neutralised back in 1951 when you had, or 52 when you had Operation Robot, which was a plan brought out by the Treasury, which would have made the Americans selling sterling. That would have counteracted those effects really well, but that was stopped by sort of the cabinet in 52, and so and that was I think that was Lord forgot his name now. Churchill's brain, he was known as Lord Charwell, opposed it, and so the Conservatives have a number of opportunities in the run up to Suez of sort of making things better or putting Britain in a better situation. So Robot not withdrawing the troops from Suez, and they either take them or don't take them, and we suffer the consequences in 56, 57.
No, and to add to what Horace said, Churchill lead the Macmillan in a row, thanks Tories, and don't forget you then had Alec Douglas Hume as well for good measure before they kicked out in 64.
And then we're lucky, Hitman, because then we get Soviet agent Harold Wilson. God. Oh my God, when I look at when I look at British political history post 1945, I detest Churchill, but you know what? God,
At least he wasn't a Soviet agent.
afterwards.
Wilson.
I will say, the 1964, like the 1964 election, I think like the only clearly mass silver lining was silver lining mass was so the Tory MP elected in Smethwick, who my granddad voted for, was quite basic. Other than that, yeah, I'm tending to agree. Like, there's a history.
Horace has just mentioned Edward Heath, who, when I was a young man, right, and I was a young man, and I'm old enough to remember when Edward Heath was Prime Minister and betrayed us by taking us into what was then the European Economic Community. But he was also well known back then for being a pedophile who used to take little boys on his yacht and be nasty to them, which is all I can say on YouTube. But that was his reputation even back then. All right. Anyway, guys, allegedly, as Lothar Sheffield says in the chat, allegedly. But, you know, on the other hand, most people are right. When a lot of people say something, it's usually true. This is a difficult subject for us, guys, because militarily, Operation Musketeer was a complete success. Wherever the Royal Marines and the Parachute Regiment and the Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm did their stuff, the Egyptians were beaten, killed, wounded, or surrendered pretty quickly, to be honest. But that's my main interest in this stuff. I like military and naval history, and in that sense, Operation Musketeer in 1956, even though it took the British government 3 or 4 months to organize it because of the cuts in the British military, actually, you know what? It worked pretty well. But politically, yeah, it was a disaster. And Anthony Eden was a weak bastard, to be honest. He was. And wasn't prepared to say to the American president, you want to destroy your most important ally against the Soviet Union? Go do it, mate. Because, to be fair, Margaret Thatcher in 1982, when Reagan couldn't decide who to support compared to Britain and Argentina, Margaret Thatcher was able to say to Reagan, who's your most important ally out of Britain and Argentina? And obviously it was Britain. And so the Americans did actually come down on the British side. But yeah, I want to say a couple of things before we move on. We are going to be doing some Middle Eastern stuff in the next couple of months. We're going to talk about Oman and Britain in the 60s and 70s. And we're also going to be talking about Aden in 1966 and 1967. And both of those streams are going to depend fairly heavily on Hitman, who is our Middle Eastern expert. Like Aaron is our British politics expert. Hitman is absolutely our Middle Eastern expert. And we are going to do those couple of streams in the coming months. By the way, next week, this time, we're going to do the Battle of Waterloo because it's going to be the 18th of June. And we are going to tell you, or at least I'm going to tell you, my other guests might have other plans, but I'm going to tell you how the Duke of Wellington and the British Army were going to win the Battle of Waterloo, whether or not the Prussians turned up, and the only difference was the Prussians were able to pursue the French and therefore stop them fighting another serious battle before the end of the war. But basically, Wellington and the British Army won it. And that's even being more fair to Wellington than I should be, because actually, like, almost half his army was shit from Germany and Holland, whereas only about less than half his army was actually British, and even they were mostly second battalions who hadn't been sent to Canada to defeat the Americans trying to invade that place. But anyway, we'll talk about that next week. Hitman, carry on.
Yes. Regarding the Aden stream, that'll be a very nice follow up to this one, because again, it's us trying to cling on in a military emergency against insurgent Arab forces, and
Nasser, we beat the Hitman. Am I not right in saying we actually beat them and then ran away?
Yeah, pretty much. It's like Suez all over again, and Nasser's involved supporting the enemy. It's like Suez Crisis 2 Electric Boogaloo.
Like the Argyll and Southern Highlanders, a very fine Highland regiment, went in there and beat the shit out of the enemy. We basically took over Crater again, which was the town, and then we ran away because Harold Wilson was in charge. But whatever.
Yes, that's another link when you mentioned Wilson, is that he'll be a nice antagonist in that stream alongside Nasser.
And of course, when we were leaving Aden, undermined what David Sterling was doing in North Yemen in their civil war at the time as well. So we didn't just which our side, the royalists, were actually winning, and so it wasn't just the loss of Suez, not the loss of Aden. It was the loss of North Yemen as a pro-Western, particularly pro-British ally to the Soviets.
Yeah, pretty much true. If you look at Oman in the 60s and the 70s, the British got rid of the Arab leader there, probably killed him, to be honest. And then, used the British Parachute Regiment, the Royal Marines, the SAS, to win the war there. But we'd already given up on Aden. Why the hell didn't we hang on to Aden? I don't know. Some people today will no doubt have heard of the, what are they called? These Arab guys who keep attacking our ships in the Red Sea.
Oh, the Houthis.
Yeah, they're doing that exactly from Aden. That's where the British colony was, Aden. But, whatever.
Yeah,
the Houthis are doing this exactly from what used to be Aden, which the British used to run. But apparently it's okay. So whatever.
You want to start talking about the phase 1 and phase 2 of the military side of all this? Because you have, because as I was mentioning earlier, the Israelis, they were the first to go in on the 26th of October, and they have their and they have onset the thing called Operation Kadesh, and they quite aggressive. Amr, who's in charge of the Egyptian army, he underestimates how much the land they've taken. So you get a position where a lot of these forces get trapped and really undoes his own battle plan. So in 4 days' time, on the 30th, when we landed, when we take over Port Said and the French take over Port Fouad, I believe it was called. Yeah, we're able to win it quite handily. Like, for example, I think there was one scenario where we fought over a cemetery. 30 Egyptians who were like yes camped, I believe, or something like that in the cemetery, were all killed off, whereas the paratroopers on our side didn't suffer a single casualty. Such was the extremely lopsided kill to death
Which
ratio.
is no great surprise if you know anything about Egyptian soldiers and brave paratroopers, but okay. Yeah, all right. Well, guys, I don't know. I think politically we covered this fairly well. I'll be interested to see what Semiagog says about this, because Semi seems to be of the position that, you know, the city of London took over America, which I frankly don't believe, and also couldn't work out why Britain was allies with Israel in 1956. But anyway, whatever. I like Semi, by the way. I think he's a nice bloke, and I know Hitman has done several streams with him. But I like Semiagog. I think he's a good, sensible guy. I just don't think he's quite correct about that, in the same way as he seems to try and trace all evil back to the British East India Company, which also doesn't strike me as very sensible. But you know, it's just me. But
what I'll say in his defence is that he doesn't say the City of London took over America. What he's saying is that there's a group of elites in the late British Empire who jumped ship from us to America through World War II, and there's elements of both this elite in both Britain and America with the same interests. They identify more with each other than they do with their own respective populations, and it should be understood as that New York and London are both two financial nodes of this system or network, if you will.
And both shitholes, if you like. But yeah, all right, Hinman. Listen, like I said, I like Semi. I think he's a good, sensible man. Glad he's married. I think he's even married to a French woman these days. But anyway, yeah, I like Semi. He's a good bloke. We are going to do future streams on the Middle East. Look out for Aden, 1966, 67. Look out for Oman, 1960s, 1970s. But next week, or this time, we're going to do the Battle of Waterloo, which I'm going to enjoy because, for the most part, I'm a military and naval historian. So I'm going to enjoy that one. And I'm going to hopefully destroy some German falsehoods about that battle, but we'll see. So yeah, and we will also be back on Saturday for our normal Splendid Isolation stream, where I guess we're going to be talking about fucking Nigel Farage and his gay chairman of Reform UK. But, you know, we'll do that. Aaron, anything you would like to plug, mate?
Just my channel. It's Aaron James Hook on YouTube. I review books and films.
Yeah, it's a really good channel. Go and check it out. Hitman, you have an excellent channel. Would you like to plug it, sir?
Yes, I do streams occasionally. Main thing I'm working on at the moment is a series on modern Iran. Last episode, it was last Saturday, we were looking at the collapse and decline of the Safavid Empire in the late 17th and early 18th centuries and the rise of Nader Shahani of Sharid. So give that a watch. Next Tuesday, on my occasional weekly show, The Archival Discourses, I'm going to be joined by Melon and Mike of Pole. We're going to be talking about a millennial culture. So the younger ones of us in this sphere will probably give that a watch. I know Year says she's going to stay tuned for that one.
Is there millennial culture, Hitman? Really? Okay.
Yes, there is, and it's a bit cursed.
All right. I will look forward to that. Mitch, anything you want to plug, mate?
No, not for me.
All right. Aaron Hook and Hitman's channel will be linked below this stream later on. As always, I'm going to play us out of a tune, I hope, if it works, which it may well not. Let's see if it works. It might, you know. There you go, boys. Hopefully you heard it. That was The Campbells Are Coming, and it's one of the regimental marches of the wonderful Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, one of the finest regiments ever to serve in the British Army. Thank you very much to my guests, Mitch, Aaron Hook, and Hitman. We'll be back on Saturday. And in the meantime, don't let the bastards grind you down.
No, well,